entitled Contemplative Practice Across Traditions. The subtitle that we have put for this symposium is Exploring the Transformative Power of Contemplative Practice Towards Addressing the Critical Situation of our 21st Century. I am very glad and honored to be able to welcome everyone from the co-sponsors of this event, the Office of Spiritual Formation of Perkins School of Theology, the Office of External Programs of Perkins School of Theology, and the Maria Kannon Zen Center. The Maria Kannon Zen Center has been in existence 25 years here in Dallas, and so this is in conjunction with the 25th anniversary celebration of this Zen Center. And so on this occasion, we are glad to be able to really reflect not so much on our past, but on the gifts that we have been given together. And so we have invited guests, fellow journeyers, fellow practitioners from other traditions to share with us the gifts that they have received from their own contemplative practice. You will be hearing the words contemplative or contemplation or meditative and meditation. And so some may ask, what's the difference? In the Western tradition, when we say meditation, we have in mind Marcus Aurelius in the early centuries, the emperor who had his reflections on the nature of things and on the state of the state and so forth, and on the meaning of life. And so they're called meditations. Also, toward the modern era, René Descartes, reflecting on questions like, do I really exist? Maybe I don't. Maybe this is just an illusion, and so forth. So he came out with those reflections, and they're entitled meditation. So in the Western tradition, we associate the word meditation with reflective, analytical, connective use of the so-called left brain, as some neuroscientists would put it. Whereas contemplation in the Western tradition comes from the Greek word which means to see, to behold. And in the New Testament, in the fourth gospel, that word to see is used very often to express the dimension of seeing the divine. Seeing Jesus is seeing the Father, seeing the one who is truly unknown, seeing through what is seen and felt in our midst. So to contemplate is, in words that I would like to suggest, to see with the eyes of the heart. In Buddhist language, the word meditation somehow corresponds with this Western word contemplation. So we are using the words interchangeably in the symposium. And in that regard, what we would like to really learn about, some of you have already been in this practice for years and years, some are just beginning it, some are exploring whether to take it on or not. So what is it that we are going to explore today with our illustrious speakers who will be introduced in a little while? Well, we are really exploring ways in which we may be able to see with the eyes of the heart. Many of us are familiar with the book The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And toward the end, we get that message that it is only with the heart that you can see reality. So in that regard, how can we see with the eyes of the heart, and not just with the eyes of the flesh, so to speak, that is this subject-object way of seeing that leads to a lot of conflict, a lot of opposition, a lot of violence that we see in the world today. How can we go beyond this conflict, this violence, this animosity that exists among people who breathe together without realizing that we are connected? So, contemplative practice is one way of learning how to see with the eyes of the heart, so we can see truly and really see where peace lies, where our connectedness lies, and where the true meaning of what it is to be fully a human or sentient being can be discovered. So thank you for being here. So please join us in this exploration. I will now hand the mic over to our moderator, Helen Cortez, who is also a Zen teacher at Maria Kannon Zen Center, as well as executive director of the Zen Center. Helen?
Thank you, Ruben. So I don't need any introduction because he already introduced me. So without much ado, I think you've already gone to the website, you've already gotten a flyer, you're very familiar with our panelists. So just very briefly, I'll just mention their name, and then you can look up, really up, and see their picture and what particular tradition they represent. So first of all, we have Christian Bod, who is in mindfulness meditation. And then Sandy Guanchal, representing the Christian meditation or centering prayer. And then thirdly, we have Kay Lish, who is from the Tibetan tradition. And then we have Bobby Perkins from the Order of Interbeing. And maybe you're more familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh, that kind of meditation. And last but not least, we have Leanne Nail, who is in the Zen tradition. So each of the speakers will be given 7 to 8 minutes to present, and we'll just move in. So the order of the program today, you already have the program, so we will try to stick to the time as much as we can. So without much ado, I'd like to present Christian Bod from the mindfulness meditation.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you for inviting me here today. I'm going to speak about the mindfulness meditation practices. These are practices that have developed primarily in the United States and Europe, and that are oftentimes considered non-religious practices, secular practices. So I may be the only one on this panel from that side of the spectrum. These are practices, even though they are considered secular, they are rooted, their history, they were born in the Buddhist tradition, and particularly the Theravada Buddhist tradition. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, American and European went to these countries, learn with teachers from those traditions, and then when they returned to the United States or came as native people, they started to talk, to teach to their Western audience. And over the last 50 years, this practice have changed and evolved and morphed in many ways. They have lost some of their original rituals that were part of the Buddhist tradition. They have lost quite a bit even of the core beliefs of the Buddhist tradition. And they have also gained new clothes, so to speak, as they merge with the Western views or Western worldviews. And a couple of the most striking features of these practices is how much they have merged today with Western psychology and Western science. When I say Western psychology, I mean both the therapeutic aspect, the clinical psychology, as well as the cognitive psychology and the more scientific and neuroscience aspects. So that's probably the defining features of these practices. So just to give you an idea of what it means day to day to practice or to teach these practices, I'm going to run through 3 different aspects. And as you'll notice, they are not very different from what my friends here are going to describe. The first aspect are the concentration types of practices, the so-called shamatha practices that are aimed at helping us become less distracted, less jumpy, less reactive. So these are typically practices that are done in sitting meditations that involve focusing on the breath or focusing on aspects of the body or the body as a whole. beyond these concentration practices, we have those practices that are more often associated with this tradition, and these are the so-called vipassana practices. They were called, nowadays we call them more insight practices or inquiry practices. And those can be done sitting on a cushion, or those can be done just as well day to day in our daily lives. And basically this involves opening up to whatever experience is arising in every moment. You probably have heard a lot about those kind of practices. There are a lot of advocates these days. It's important to know that in the mindfulness meditation practices, experience means all aspects of experience. So we always go through bodily experience, that are very important, the feeling tone of our experience, the emotional arousal that come to us on a moment-to-moment basis, especially as we feel them in the body, and also, just as important, the mental experience, the cognitive experience, our ideas, our opinions, the way we construct the world. So all of those practices are aimed at kind of cultivating a sort of open awareness on a moment-to-moment basis in order to kind of see more clearly our patterns of reactivity, patterns of automaticity in the body, the heart, and the mind. And then the third type of practices are the so-called loving kindness practices. Those are meant geared at opening the heart, really. Loving kindness practices, compassion practices, equanimity practices. And in our tradition, they are actually explicit speaking inwardly particular verses or particular phrases that are aimed at bringing about this kind of heart-opening experience in the practitioner. So all of these three prongs are what most teachers will present, and this is what I teach. I just want to make, before I finish, I'd like to make another point about what is really particular to this tradition, again, as it has developed in the last 50 years or so in this country, in Europe and other parts of the world. It's really this, the merging, again, with psychology in a very intentional and intensive way. It is, as you probably know, it's not unusual nowadays for therapists, clinical psychologists, to offer mindfulness meditation to their clients. Likewise, most mindfulness meditation teachers will be involved in their own therapy, as well as always suggesting or recommending that their clients would do the same. So I will. Am I out of time, Helen? Am I doing well? Oh, great. And I also want to mention that actually there are individuals in this tradition that are actually functioning as both mindfulness meditation teachers and therapists. And they kind of go, one side of the office is the mindfulness meditation, and the other side of the office is the therapist office. So again, probably something that is a little different from what we hear today. And finally, the other thing that's really most exciting to me personally is the merging of the coming closer to Western science. Western scientists have become really enthralled with mindfulness meditation practices, the neuroscience, trying to develop a new vocabulary of sort to talk about those mindfulness practices. So again, I feel like I'm going to be a little bit the odd man or the odd woman out here, but I look forward to hear what the other panelists have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Now I'd like to introduce Sandy Guanchal. from the Centering Prayer Group.
And thank you, Helen. Thank you. I represent Contemplative Outreach of Dallas. I've been a coordinator here for about 20 years. And we have several groups. We offer retreats. And it's been growing. And when we first started the practice years ago, I was in New England, and it wasn't a practice that was always welcomed. There might have been 2 or 3 people that would show up because there was such a lack of understanding of the Christian contemplative tradition. And it's so wonderful to see a room full of people that cross different traditions today. This is an honor to be here. The Christian contemplative tradition, there's a lot of writings, starting way back in 300 BC with John Cassian and Gregory the Great. And we move up to the Cloud of Unknowing, the Book of Privy Council, and that was written in the 14th or 15th century. The interesting thing about the book of the Cloud, it was written for people who wanted to experience God's presence and God's action within them. Actually, chapter 7 is where they derive, where Thomas Keating pulled together those ideas and wrote the centering prayer method that I'll speak to today. First of all, what I'd like to say is that centering prayer is a contemplative practice, and it's both a relationship with God and a discipline to foster that relationship. It's based in Scripture. Most of the practice is based in Scripture, but especially the daily practice. From Matthew 6:6, when you pray, go to your inner room and pray to your Father in secret. And your Father who sees you in secret will reward you. Centering prayer is not a technique. It's not a relaxation exercise. It's not locutions and visions. And it's not charismatic prayer. It's a path of transformation that restructures the way that you see the world. We talk about prayer as relationship, and relationships grow, and they grow and develop through intimacy, like our relationship with God. They usually grow through 4 stages. The first stage is acquaintanceship. You know, when you first meet someone, we're a little bit formal. It's like when you learn your prayers as a child. You say your prayers in the morning, before grace, before meals. You say the prayer in the evening. And then after a while, that prayer of acquaintanceship grows into a more friendliness. Becomes a little bit more awkward, a little more informal. And we start to ponder the prayers. And we might wonder, our Father in heaven, who is our Father? What is the kingdom come? So we're really starting to develop that place in our heart for God. And as that we mature and we grow through that prayer, we come to a place of friendship. And friendship is commitment. And it's a commitment to that practice. And all the while that we're growing, God is seeing that. And God honors that. And maybe at that stage of prayer, the virtues of faith, hope, and love are increased in us. So that now that prayer will become one of intimacy, which is fidelity. It's fidelity to the practice day by day. And it's also being present to God. Fundamental to centering prayer is the divine indwelling. When we go and we sit in this practice of prayer, we're moving from our psychological awareness to the spiritual level of our being. And we're always sitting in that prayer with an open mind and an open heart. And throughout the practice, we open, we surrender, and we let go. And we let go of what we call the false self, or all of the illusions in our life. And as we let go of those programs we call programs for happiness, we're growing and developing a pure heart. How do we do that? The first guideline in the practice is we choose a sacred word, is the symbol of our intention to consent to God's presence and God's action within. And the second guideline in the practice is we sit comfortably and we silently introduce the sacred word as the symbol of our intention. You know, we say silently, it's a silent prayer. It's an epiphatic prayer. We don't use any words, no images, no concepts. And the third guideline of the prayer, when we become aware that we're thinking, and we'll always be thinking unless we're dead. So we kind of get used to that idea that thoughts will come, and we just ever so gently let the thoughts go down the stream of consciousness. And the fourth guideline in the prayer is we simply sit at the end of the practice with an attitude of gratitude for what's been given in the prayer. The sacred word is usually a 1 or a 2 syllable word. It isn't the inherent meaning of the word that matters. What matters is the word is a facilitator to help us let go of what's coming up in our mind or the noise in our mind. It's important to know that it's not a mantra. We don't sit in the practice and say that word over and over. We just simply let it rise within us when we're aware that we're thinking. And thoughts, without thoughts, there wouldn't be a prayer. So every time we return then to the sacred word and we consent to God's presence and God's action, that's the prayer. A lot of people say, well, what's the prayer? That's it. It's in the letting go and in the surrendering. The fruit of contemplative prayer is wisdom, understanding, and self-knowledge. What's important to remember is in the prayer, when we're letting go moment by moment of the false self, and we're letting go of all that isn't real within us, God replaces those spaces in us with the gifts and the fruits of the Holy Spirit. The goal of the prayer is purity of heart, and in that purity of heart, God's will and your will become one. Like St. Paul says, I live now, not I, but Christ lives in me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. So now we have Kay Lish from the Tibetan tradition. Okay.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be able to be here and to have this topic in front of us. I think it's my heart realizes that it's a wild, crazy world out there and seems to be getting a little crazier all the time. And I think in the space that we live in, contemplative practice is a refuge. And so I come to you representing Tibetan Buddhism. I know I was born into a Catholic family and from a very beginning, early part, was raised with a lot of love for spirituality. And I think I realized, though, in my early teens that I wanted more, that Catholicism wasn't enough for me. And my brother and I both started just looking for meditation practices. And we started our own journey at the Dallas Public Library. And I think that journey continued for me because I knew I wanted a teacher. I wanted an actual physical teacher. And so I was lucky enough in the 70s, I was on the faculty at Ohio State, and someone was staying at my house, and they encouraged me to go to a bookstore where there was a lovely, my clock is talking to me, but there was a lovely Tibetan man who did not speak English, who was speaking through a translator who had a horrific cold, that was trying to explain this very abstract and esoteric practice, really. And I was trying to understand it, and I think what I got from him was this man who was just so amazingly peaceful and at ease with himself that after the talk, my husband and I went up to him and said, well, we would like to start a center in our home. And so we did. And that was really without having much of a foundation. It was more from that experience of actually falling in love and feeling that attraction. And so the practice that I go to is based on the teacher. You know, it really is an unbroken lineage of transmission of what this Tibetan Buddhism is all about, from teacher to teacher to teacher. And so if you are attracted to it, usually you will know. You will meet the teacher and you will kind of know that you're attracted. And so if you're not, you're probably not attracted, you know. And so I think it's kind of self-evident. And so most mornings I will do my Tibetan Buddhist practice. The thing about Tibetan Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism is that it is not one practice. It is a plethora of practices that are based on mantra, visualization, doing contemplative reading and study, doing mudras with the hands, doing prostrations with the body. So the practice that I do is a practice that is what is the practice for me right now. And so the practice, I've been doing them for 40 years. So the practices that I have done are different. So right now I'm doing what's called the foundation practices. And so it's based on a set of 4 different practices. The first is designed to purify the body, and it uses a lot of physical prostrations. You get very sweaty doing it. The second is a 100-syllable mantra, which is designed to purify the speech. And you repeat each of these practices a lot of times. I would say 111,111 times. So it's like each practice you do, you repeat a lot. And the reason you repeat them a lot is because we're pretty stupid. You know, we need a lot of help, basically. You know, because it's like we are, you know, stuck in a lot of old tapes, most of us, you know, from our past lives, from our concepts. You know, we don't really get it, you know, what's happening. And I still don't really get it. All I know is that it's a process of gradual unfolding, of gradually coming more fully alive. And so the practice I'm doing right now is called mandala practice. So mandala practice is a beautiful little practice. It's really based on opening the heart. And the practice is one where you create this amazing mandala. And you create it in your mind, and you can create it with jewels and things too, but you create it, and then you first give it to all the sacred beings who have worked over many, many lifetimes to become enlightened, and you give it to them first as an offering. And then you just give it away to everyone. And so the little prayer I say every morning is quite lovely, and I was just going to share it with you. It says, I anoint the earth with fragrant water, scatter flowers, adorn it with Mount Meru, the 4 continents, the sun and the moon. Imagining this a Buddha field, I offer it so that all beings may experience this pure realm. So that's the essence, really, is the practice in Buddhism. You do the practice to work on yourself, and then you give it away to the best of your ability, to all sentient beings with that sense of open heart. So I think the essence of the practice is to repeatedly work on yourself and your own sense of being able to be joyful and to be present, and then to wish that for others. And so there's a lot of different ways to do it. And I think for me, the value of having a physical teacher is that you get that repeated instruction. It's wonderful to have books, it's wonderful to have your own practice, but it's especially wonderful to have a physical teacher that can help tease you, guide you, instruct you, sometimes humiliate you, whatever, but it's a process, it's an ongoing process, I think, of learning how to just to realize that what we have right now is a precious human birth. And not everybody gets that, especially gets it in a way where we have access to these kinds of people, to these kinds of abilities to understand, so that we have to take advantage of that. And the best way to take advantage of it is to get a practice. And I don't know that it really matters what that practice is, as long as it's one that you do and that appeals to you. And so I have one that appeals to me, and if you'd like to learn more about that, the center would love to have you come for a visit. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kay. Our next presenter is Bobby Perkins. She has just been appointed. Can you say a little bit about your experience?
Yes, of course.
Bobby, so we have Bobby Perkins. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And thank you to the Maria Kannon Zen Center for sponsoring this symposium. And thank you for 25 years of being a beacon of light for people in North Texas. I'm really honored to be given the opportunity to share about my practice in the Zen tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. There are many contemplative practices in this tradition, but I'll just focus on a couple of them today. The first that I want to talk about is what's called the 5 mindfulness trainings. If you're familiar with Buddhist teachings, you know that he gave us 5 precepts that are offered to help us live a life that is as much as possible to avoid suffering. And so he said, in order to do that, avoid killing, avoid stealing, lying, avoid sexual misconduct, and avoid ingesting toxins. So our teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, took those 5 precepts and fashioned a set of mindfulness trainings that give us some guidelines for following those precepts. They've been very, very helpful to me and to a lot of people that I know, because even though there are many things that we may not be able to follow, like the letter of the teaching, still it's definitely something to aspire to. And what we discover is that as we read and contemplate these teachings, these trainings, we begin to see things more deeply. We begin to notice beyond the surface of things that are happening. We begin to look more deeply into ourselves and how we might be contributing to the well-being of others, or to the lack of well-being of others and ourselves. So the 5 mindfulness trainings have been a big part of my practice. We are given the opportunity in this tradition to make a commitment to follow those 5 mindfulness trainings. And there is a transmission ceremony for that. When a person commits to the 5 mindfulness trainings and goes through the ceremony in which you kind of declare publicly your commitment, you're given a Dharma name if you choose. And in that process, I was given the Dharma name, Pure Expression of the Heart. And the reason that mine is it ends with "of the heart," because I was privileged to be at a monastery in a retreat when Thich Nhat Hanh was actually there and in charge of this transmission ceremony. So I really feel very honored and privileged that I got to see him and be in a retreat where he was for actually in 2011 and then again in 2013. So that was a really special thing in my life. Just watching Thich Nhat Hanh walk, watching him move to the chalkboard. In those days, they still used a chalkboard. And everything he did was so absolutely mindful. You could just see it. So quite an inspiration to be in a retreat where he was present. The other contemplative practice, it kind of follows on the heels of 5 mindfulness trainings. Some of us make a commitment to follow 14 mindfulness trainings. The monks and nuns who are a part of Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition also take these 14 mindfulness trainings. And then it is also offered to lay people who want to commit, who want to make that kind of commitment. And when we make that commitment, we are ordained, they call it, into the order of interbeing. This is an order that Thich Nhat Hanh established back in the 60s when he was doing his best to help villagers and people who were being affected by the war in Vietnam. And so he ordained 6 young people, and they did what they could to collect supplies and go into the villages to help people rebuild and take care of those that were wounded. This did not garner any favors for him or his people from either side because he refused to take sides. But that's a story that I'd be happy to share with you after if you'd like to hear more. So the 14 mindfulness trainings are guidelines for members of the Order of Interbeing and the monks and nuns who are part of his tradition. We are encouraged to contemplate the 5 mindfulness trainings and then the 14 mindfulness trainings often so that we can begin to embody those precepts. And so there is a lot of the things we do are very similar to what you talked about in centering prayer, and even in the mindfulness meditation that you teach, Christian. It's, there are so many similarities in all of the things that we do. I was ordained, as I said, last weekend, actually last Saturday, and that is the reason for the brown jacket. All of the members of the Order of Interbeing wear a brown jacket. The monks and nuns, of course, wear brown robes. My name now, my Dharma name, is True Transmission of Mindfulness. Something really to try to live into. And that is one of the reasons they give you that name, is so that you do kind of live into it. We're not expected to be that right away. I'll just wrap up by saying that before I started working at the Dallas Meditation Center in 2011, I was on a kind of a solitary path. Since then, I've had the support of a Dharma teacher, a mentor, the Sangha, a lot of wonderful resources and support that have been supporting my practice. And I'm very, very grateful for that. So in my daily life, that looks like meditating every day, facilitating meditation workshops and meditation groups, reaching out and doing outreach kinds of things to help teach mindfulness and meditation to groups outside of the meditation center. And all of those activities flow best when they're grounded in a firm foundation of contemplative practice. I'm very interested to hear what everyone else is saying, and I'm happy to see how we all seem to be supporting the same practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. Last but not least, we have Leah. Leah actually flew all the way from Oregon to join us. So, Leah, from the Zen tradition. Thank you.
I'm a therapist, and so yes, I do feel a deep connection between this practice and the other wisdom the mind has to offer. 32 years ago, I wandered into a Zen monastery in upstate New York, and for me, the calling to practice came from a building. It really was walking into a space and feeling the energy of 40, 50, 60 people coming together and sitting in silence and in silent contemplation. From a number of different traditions. It was a Buddhist monastery, but there were many Christians as well coming, and I loved the conversations, the cross-fertilization. I was raised Episcopalian, and I still am a member and love the tradition, but at a certain point of my growing up, I was looking for more, I was hungry. And I don't know why this particular building said, this is it. And so I moved in for 2 years. I was in residential training. We get up at 3:50 in the morning and sit, meditate, eat in silence, work in silence. And the core of the practice and training is the relationship with the teacher. So I was lucky to have a number of key teachers in my life, originally at the monastery, and then when we eventually moved here to Oregon, Ruben Abito. And so one of my questions has been that Buddhism gave me this ability, Zen Buddhism, to go deeply into my life. And then what does that bring back to my roots? And we have two paths usually. So the practice began in India, came to China, and then Japan, and is coming to America. And my understanding of Zen Buddhism is we have really two ways of working, and it depends on personality and what's calling for you. So there is one side that is very deeply faith and trust oriented. And it is just sitting in the clarity of the human experience and trusting that all along is what, as we settle, will reveal the selfless nature of all things. The other practice, which I do more predominantly, is for those of us who have to have something to do and who have a lot of questions. I always say it's koan study, but it's a lot like if you have a small dog at home and you give it a toy and they pick it up and want to know, and have something to work with, to take on. And so for me, and koan study is really hard. You're given something that is in a certain way unanswerable. It's a conundrum. And it asks you to shed all of the things that you've carried along as the answers for your whole life. You usually get on your own squirrel wheel, so you're sitting in meditation and, oh, what's the answer, what's the answer? And so you're going, and this will usually go on. Luckily, I had 2 years in residency. It goes on for quite a while until you run yourself out, literally. And that begins, those storylines, the answers we've always had but weren't quite enough, begin to drop away. And who you think you are is released. And one of the basic teachings of Buddhism is that life can be suffering, but there is a way beyond that. And for me, that sitting practice, period of residency followed by many retreats, and the gift of great teachers in my life who were willing to wait while my squirrel wheel ran its course and ask hilariously difficult questions. I was blessed at a certain point with a wonderful just moment of grace in that monastery, one day of sitting where it was an old Catholic retreat center. So on the inside where we all sit, there's a Buddha, there's an altar for Buddhists. And yet on the outside wall from the Christian tradition is, I think it's called bidding or biding Christ,
The Christ, the large Christ.
And there was just a moment, which was a gift from the universe, of neither inside nor outside, them not being separate. And for me and where I'd come from, that was a shattering of much of myself and a rebirth. And so what I'm called to do in my life is help make that possible for anyone. We all have our own conundrums and our own path. So again, the key is to find a place of practice, a teacher to work with, and to set aside, as everyone has said, the time in your daily life to take this up.
Thank you, Leanne. We've been sitting for almost an hour now, so I think I'd like a very quick break. If you can just stand up and do some stretching for 30 seconds, because it's not very good to be sitting continuously.
Uh-oh. That's a dangerous.
So at this point, I'd like to ask each of the panelists the same question. And they'll be given at least 2 minutes to respond. And please look at the clock over there. So instead of starting with Christian, I'd like to start with Leanne. So the question is there anything you would describe as transformative in your life and experience with this practice?
My favorite female teacher, Chosen Sensei, used to say very clearly at the beginning of a long retreat, there are 2 kinds of retreat practices or life practices. One is transformational. So that's when you're able to go away and practice with a group usually, sometimes for a week, sometimes just for a day, which in our tradition is called Zazenkai. You're sitting a lot, so usually 9 to 12 hours a day with walking interspersed, silent meals, working in the garden quietly, but the whole time you're focused on your practice, either breath awareness and shikantaza or koan study. So you're able to just give away your stories. So the whole neurosis of what's ever been driving you crazy, first it comes up, and it abides for a little bit, but eventually it'll drop away. And so the transformational aspect is usually in the beginning, it's just a moment of, oh, look at this possibility. And the second is all of the things that make us a little nutty, you see their impermanent nature. They arise, abide, and pass away. Just like the West Texas thunderstorm. That's what I say to my students. Students will come in and go, I've been stuck in this thing for 2 days, and it's welcome it. Go and sit, welcome the storm. Realize its nature, that's being human. But then see the impermanence, that's the freedom. So transformational practice takes time. It usually takes retreat practice, and either in the retreat or shortly after, there's this aha! Then, and Chosen Sensei used to say, is the rest of your life, which is 99.99%. That's translational practice. It's all the other days. They are informed by the aha moments, and they are informed by the techniques that you've developed on the pillow or on the chair and with your teacher to see through the suffering nature of reality. It's that simple.
Thank you. Yes, transformation happens like that. And for me, the most transformative practice has been the study of the 5 and the 14 mindfulness trainings, because it puts into kind of a modern day context the ways in which we can live in accordance with the 5 precepts that were given to us by the Buddha. So practicing those, for me, comes in several different ways. One is meditation on the cushion. One is reflection, inner reflection about how am I actually doing these things or not. And other practices are certainly having the support of the Sangha, being with Sangha and practicing with a community is really, really important to me and has been one of the most transformative practices in my experience. I did not have much luck going it on my own, and I find that having the energy and support of the Sangha is really a wonderful way to support transformation in myself and in others as well. I also like chanting because that helps to quiet my mind. It helps me to focus, gets rid of all the chatter so that I'm really just chanting. I like to draw mandalas because that also gives my mind something to focus on, and clears the way, because when my mind is clear of extraneous and distracting thoughts, I can receive insights that help me to then put my transformation into practice.
I love this question because it's a very humbling question, to ask yourself. So, okay, been doing this practice for 40 years, how are you different than you were 40 years ago? And I think, it's a very question that we should ask ourselves, really. And for me, I think what I realize is that a lot of it is just seeing my own neurotic patterns, is seeing how stuck I am. And I think I noticed it first in my body, and when I started to become more aware of how much I was not breathing and how rigid my body was. In fact, so rigid that I had to, even though I was a yoga practitioner and have been for 40 years, that I had to go get a hip replacement, because there's just so much old stuff, that's in there. And seeing, and so the purification, I think, happens gradually. Maybe it starts a little bit with the body, just beginning to realize that it's precious, and I better take care of it. And then second, a bit with the speech, noticing when I've said something really, really stupid, to go, oh yeah, okay, just to notice that. And to not say it quite so many times, And then with my mind, I think it's beginning just to notice the potential that I can change it, that I don't have to be stuck in the same thought, that it's my choice, and that there's openness and space there, and to more often to make that choice, to be in a space that is more joyful, because it makes a difference to other people, and so if I choose that, it's helpful.
In the centering prayer practice, we generally practice twice a day, 20 to 30 minutes. And it's a process of always letting go, surrendering, letting go of whatever's happening. But it isn't meant to be just 2 sits. The practice is one that we carry out into the day, into whatever comes along in the day. And we all have busy lives and stuff happens and things come up. But one of the things that I've really learned, and that's to trust. And to just let go into it, and that God is in it. That I'm not going to change a situation or a person, but I do trust that God knows exactly what's happening. And it's also, I think the practice has lowered my anxiety quite a bit about the present moment. And I guess that's all. There's a lot of little things, a lot of subtle things. One of the important things that I see in myself is more freedom, more interior freedom. There's more spaciousness. And that's something that you can know, and only in the experience, I think, of the practice.
So that's a lot to take in from the other four people, and I maybe try to say the same thing in a different language. I guess we come to practice at different time in our lives. Some of us start early, in our 20s, our 30s, and some of us come to it much later. For me, I started really contemplative practices in my late 40s, about 30 years ago. So I was a full-form person with all the baggage that you have described. So for me, everything about contemplative practice, of course, became transformational. The practice of attention that I described earlier were very helpful to help to figure out that attention can be diverted so much, and that we have sort of a responsibility to pick or to decide where we want our attention to be. So that was very helpful. But the practice of inquiry or insight, likewise, like other panelists have said, we live and we create, we live through our automatic patterns, and people have mentioned already, automatic patterns of the body, of how we walk, how we behave in the world, automatic pattern of emotional reactivity, and of course automatic patterns of thoughts. So the practice helps make all of that much more solid, much more soft, much more optional. So we can, like others have said, I don't really have to do this, like when I start seeing those patterns. So, and then of course, biggest pattern automaticity of all is how we conceive of a self, and which is kind of the big prize of the Buddhist tradition. We think of ourselves most of the time, for most of our lives, are separate, a separate entity that is kind of living inside, and the rest of the world is in the outside. And as the others will have said, with those practices, what dissolves, what becomes more porous, more soft, less limiting, is this sense of self. And some of you have described this really beautifully. So this is what practice is really all about, beginning to make it more porous, more just dissolve that sense of separation between the self and the rest of the world, so that the sense of self becomes just larger and larger, not in a grandiose way, but just in a very lived and profound way.
Yeah, thank you. Each of the panelists responded according to their personal experience, after having sat for some time. So this second question, I'd like to call, each a panelist on random rather than go left or right. So the question is, how can the practice of meditation or contemplation help us address the issues facing our society, including social tensions, racial and religious prejudice, etc.? Or if you can just share stories of what difference contemplative practice has made to the actions in society taken by yourselves or people, I'd like to start with Sandy, please.
Well, I have to say that that our practice says that we respond to God's presence and God's action within us. And God is present in all of humankind. And, how do you transform other people? I think that it begins with oneself. And I believe that that healing that happens in oneself is transmitted to family generation to generation. But I think, and I had just read a little article by Teilhard de Chardin, and he was talking about some of the dysfunction today in the world. And I like how he said in a little prayer, he said, to pray for the grace, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, to pray for the grace to see God in the fire, to see God in the hurricane, to see God in the tragedy, and to embrace and to love that situation. And with the grace of God, I really believe that together, if everyone had a practice, that we could bring people up to a higher level of consciousness, and that transformation of the world would happen.
Thank you. Kate?
I was just thinking that there's multiple ways to see reality, and each day we have, we see a lot. You know, one choice we have is to numb ourselves, to not to ignore it, to go, so, whoo, I'm glad it didn't happen to me, or to realize that things happen in this world for a reason. So things are happening now maybe at a faster pace. We're more aware of it because we hear about it repeatedly. Young people are going to say what's on their mind a bit more openly. And so my sense about it all is it's kind of a time when we have to just be bigger, bolder, brighter. You know, whoever you are is good enough, and just begin to put it out there, and the best, and kind of go with your instinct about it. Just decide how to show up each moment, each day, whether it's with your self, with your friends, with your family, or in a bigger space. You know, I'm really proud of a lot of friends that I have now that are starting to step into a bigger space to try to do something about climate change, or to do something about emotional intelligence, and how to teach that to young people. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, and it's really just figuring out what speaks to your own heart, and start stepping into it in a bigger way, because there's a lot of pain in our world now, and there's also a lot of brilliance and a lot of brightness. So it's like bringing those things together more.
Thank you. Leanne?
I love this question because there's a koan that says, please, how do you stop the fighting on the other side of the river? I was very young when I got to work on this koan, and was in residency. And at a certain point, you kind of think you're pretty good at working with these, and you go in and you make your great answers. And my teacher would just ring his bell. And this went on for days and days and months and months and months. And I thought I had it right, and I understood, and I got angrier and angrier. And I'm very slow as a Zen student because my teacher was doing this purposely, until I was that fight on the other side of the road. Why am I not getting this? You can have some insight into it's not out there, and that I've appreciated that someone was there for me to make my life miserable, so I could really see some little glimmer of how to work with times like now. This koan came up again the last couple months ago, and we were kind of escalating with nuclear crisis, and it kind of took the ground out from under me. And, where is this? Is it inside or outside? And how do we proceed? in a real way.
Kristen?
Maybe I'll try to narrow the question a little bit to issues of conflict between individuals and conflict between groups, between nations. As I was mentioning earlier, the sense of self that we create is always under threat. That's its nature. So whenever a person is going to feel under threat, there's an automatic reaction to harden the self, to go deeper into this sense of alienation, me versus the rest of the world. And of course, we see the same with groups or with nations. Whenever a group or a nation feels under threat, whether it's true or it's just imagined, likewise, the group of a nation is going to harden its internal cohesion and have an increase this idea of us versus them. So this is kind of a basic dynamic of human nature, both individual and in group. So the mindfulness practices and the contemplative practices are really directly aimed at this. That's what they do. They help us see those dynamics in ourselves, in our group, in our in-groups, and they help us soften those barriers and kind of sit back and take a step back and, as I said earlier, begin to dissolve those differences. So I think the mindfulness, the contemplative practices are paramount to help us with those issues.
Yes, I take my example from Thich Nhat Hanh, who showed us how to be a peaceful presence in a time of extreme conflict. And he did that by, again, sort of embodying the Buddhist teaching of the middle way, not going to either extreme, but seeking out the places where he could be effective. And so in my personal practice, I have an opportunity to interact with people who either call the meditation center or come by, and it is not uncommon that people come when they are really distressed, anxious, really tied in knots, and not even able to get enough clarity to hear their own wise thoughts. And very often, it can be as simple as reminding somebody to breathe. I'm thinking of a call that I got several weeks ago from a gentleman who was obviously really distressed, and he wanted to know if we had a meditation that very night, and we didn't. Well, do you have anything tomorrow? No. Anyway, at the end, I just said, are you in a place where you can do a little bitty meditation? And he said, yes. So I just guided him to breathe and taught him a little bitty saying that he could use with his breath. A few weeks later, he showed up at the beginner's meditation workshop with his fiancée. And so to me, this is an example of how individually we can be that ripple that helps the transformation of society.
Thank you. I actually sent an email to almost everybody asking you if you would like to submit a question, and I think I had like 10 responses. So I'd like to read one which was written by a psychotherapist. He's in Oklahoma City right now, and maybe two of our panelists would like to answer his question. Don't worry, there will be an opportunity for you to ask your question. We had index cards there, but nobody seemed to get a card. So what I'm going to do is I'll just move around and you can raise your hands after we're done with all these questions. So the question is, does the search for an experience of realization or enlightenment or union with God, or however term you like it in your tradition, tend to lead people to do away with individual struggles with anxiety or depressive feelings or other psychological issues? In short, how would you address the issue of spiritual bypassing, whereby a practitioner of meditation or contemplation tends to regard the practice as a substitute for psychotherapeutic healing? Anybody?
See a therapist. Okay. Yeah, I think it is easy to do. So it's possible to kind of shut down a little bit in the sitting. You can learn to sit and go right into what's called samadhi. It's just a wonderful, very few ripples on the pond experience. This is why you need to have a teacher, because sometimes that's great. And other times we need to see what's down there on the depths and help that go ahead and billow up. There are specific practices for when that's coming up, and teachers are trained to be able to work with that material. Sometimes it's really important to have support from a therapist and do that work as well. I've done it and I loved it. I was probably 15 years into my meditation practice, and it's phenomenal. So they work well hand in hand.
Yes, Christian.
Yeah, as in the mindfulness meditation practice, that's why there's so much emphasis on the body and on the body sensation. We have a whole variety of practices that are just designed to feel what is arising at this particular point in time in the body. Because if you ground yourself moment to moment in body sensations, in the felt sense, then the bypassing that you talk about is just much less likely. So we had a conversation with some of us teachers just last week, and some of the teachers of the mindfulness meditation teachers who were also therapists did not even understand the concept of spiritual bypassing, because for them they hadn't really imagined it or even found it in themselves.
Thank you. At this point, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but we do have some psychotherapists here, and I'd like to ask Dr. Alverlin to respond to that, if you don't mind.
On the spot.
Not to be on this.
It opens up the door to so many problems in the consultation office. Humans are tremendously creative, and we can find almost endless ways to avoid facing our issues. But one thing I like about the best thinking these days in psychology is that ultimately we must face our fears. In terms of myself, I try not to be in a big hurry. You know, people have to be strong enough, and people have to be ready. And so I entertain those sorts of questions and encourage more discussion. But ultimately, the point is that I think Christian was starting to address is that solving your problems in spiritual practice are not different. And learning that integration and how to live in the world and also preserve that inner refuge is the whole point.
Thank you. Is there any other therapists who'd like to comment on that? Anybody? Oh, yes, of course, Scott Thornton. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. That was really well put. And I would add one other thought about that, and that is that I don't see people using spiritual practice to bypass their issues. I do see them using religiosity to do that. So there's a kind of intellectualization or memorization or rote kind of quality to referring to spiritual practice of whatever tradition. But people, I don't think people who actually do contemplative practice are bypassing their spiritual issues, usually.
Thank you. Okay, the next question, it says here, is to all the panelists representing a Buddhist tradition. So the question is, can you clarify and offer guidance to an atheist or one who does not believe in God or in any similar concept, how contemplative practice can be understood and practiced?
In the Buddhist tradition, or as teaching from the Buddha, there was never any requisite to believe in God or any kind of higher power. That is one of the, to me, one of the most beautiful things about the Buddha's practice and his teaching, because it is inclusive and very practical. And what we're discovering now with all of the research that's being done on the mind and the brain is that mindfulness practices and meditation are beneficial regardless of what one's spiritual beliefs are. Even if you think your meditation was lousy, the brain scan would probably show that your brain benefited. So we're creating new neural pathways. We're decreasing blood pressure. We're increasing our ability to manage stress and anxiety. And all of those things are now being documented scientifically by the research that's being done. And they have no dependence on whether or not you believe in a God or any other higher power. So the Buddhist teachings actually, in my view, correlate to that beautifully, because his emphasis was always on living in the moment, on being kind. He said, first, do no harm, just like the medical profession does. So I don't think there's a need in the Buddhist tradition to have any kind of belief in a God.
Thank you. Anybody else?
We've started offering a refuge recovery program because about probably 10 to 20% of the people that sit with us are in recovery. And a lot of people had been verbalizing, wanting a way to use the recovery process, the AA process, without a higher power, without something that wasn't speaking to them. And so we offered refuge recovery, and we've had as many people show up for that as we're showing up for our sitting. And so there is, I think, a call for that in our society, and Buddhism can respond.
Yes. Thank you. Sandy, did you want to say something?
Just
Use your microphone, please.
Just in relationship to an atheist in the practice. One thing that I work a lot with in our practice is cultural conditioning. And people have ingrained habits and beliefs that are very hard for them to let go of and to pass through. And we had a discussion one time with Thomas Keating, and I remember his comment that it's easier to bring an atheist into the practice than it is to for someone that has had that deep cultural conditioning in a religion.
So at this point, we will have a question and answer from the audience. We have at least 10 minutes, So is there anybody wanting or having the really burning desire to ask a question? And please ask your question in one sentence, no introduction, nothing like that, just a direct question. Thank you.
Can you share with us how your meditation practices have improved your relations with those around you?
Do you want everybody or whoever? Thank you.
Well, my husband just left the room about 15 minutes ago. I can tell you everything how wonderful our relationship is.
Usually your dog notices if you're not sitting.
What I noticed is that my relationship to people I don't know has improved, like people on the freeway particularly. I used to get really upset when people would come really up close behind me and then zoom around. And now I'm more likely to think, oh, I hope you get where you're going safely without harming yourself or anybody else. That's a big difference in my attitude and my way of thinking because of my practice.
No, I'm recently divorced, so I really tried hard to stay in a marriage that was not really a good marriage for me, and I worked at it in a very Buddhist-like way to see if I could transform it, and I put a lot of energy into it. I really did, and I think he did as well. But I think what we realized is that we weren't good for each other. And I think part of finding relationships is finding your clan, the people that you should be around that are your people, that uplift you. And I think that's the purpose of Sangha many times, is because we do need each other to be in good relationship. And so I think knowing who you need to be around is very important.
Thank you. For those who don't, or for those who are not familiar with the word Sangha, it's simply a community. So we are a Sangha right now. So, Sandy?
I have a few groups that I facilitate in centering prayer, and I really love the groups. But what's interesting is to watch new people when they come in, and little by little, they all start to know one another, and friendships are always formed. But it isn't like a friendship where they know what they do in everyday life or what their work is, but it's more of spiritual friendships. And I think that the beauty of a community is that you come together and you heal one another without even having that be your goal. Because we come in and we foster the practice and we help each other stay on the path, and what's meaningful for us is shared in those groups.
Yes, it's interesting that people talk about traffic. A lot of people will describe their relationship with traffic after they've done contemplative practices for a while. And I do remember myself distinctly driving once in Colorado in the evening, and it started snowing, so I got a little tight and got a little bit intense, and all of a sudden, I don't know why, I started seeing the whole line of traffic around me as just one body. We were just, each one of us was a little cell flowing through those arteries, like you can watch it on videos, and we were just really part of one body. I was kind of struck by this vision. So, but this is to say that it's actually, there's a sense of kinship with all human beings that developed, like others have said. However, I was making the joke about my husband, and you kind of picked up on that. A relationship with intimate people do not dissolve or that quickly, because that really requires works about, as I was saying earlier, about our pattern, our activity, our conditioning, childhood experience and trauma and the like. So those are more difficult to soften than the general sense of kinship with all humanity.
Thank you. There was a gentleman who raised his hand after him.
On the front row.
Oh, sorry, I missed you.
That's right. How would you respond to people who actively try to avoid contemplation because when they engage in contemplation, it brings up pain and suffering? And that's too many.
Anybody who would like to address that first?
Else, you want to say something?
Bobby?
I would just say, in a situation like that, it's really necessary to be with someone you trust. Someone that you trust will be there to guide you through, because, it can be very painful to first begin to notice these kinds of things, but the fact is that's really important. We cannot change things we're not aware of. And so the awareness is so important. It's a key to the transformation. And it's important to find someone that you trust, to sit with you, to be with you, to help you through that initial looking at. And share, when you share the experience, the pain gets shared as well. And it's not quite as scary as it would be to do it on your own. So either with a good meditation practitioner, someone in the Sangha that you trust, or a good therapist. But in our tradition, we depend a lot on lay people. So, I think even in that community, there are lots of people who would be able to support that kind of practice.
Leah?
And I think implied in what you're saying is community itself. So the Sangha for most of us, when we practiced in a Sangha community for a very long time. And it's meant to be a container, a safe place to practice.
Okay. I know I'm a big fan of pain meditation in a sense, in that I think the pain, like whether it's physical pain in your own body, is a doorway to understand where that pain is coming from. And so I know for myself, I've had, a lot of pain in my hips, going through hip replacement, and like noticing that pain and being with it allowed me to see a lot of suffering that I'd created in my own life, in past life. So it's a doorway. I think it's the same with emotional pain. It's like, at first you don't want to think about it, but then when you start thinking about it, it's like you realize all people are in pain. It's just that a lot of people don't think about it. So it's precious to have the pain. Heartache, heartbreak is precious, because it gives you the opportunity to experience compassion, for yourself. So it's like I think pain is going to increase in our world, and it's going to definitely increase as you age. Pain is not something we can get away from. So I think it's to create a relationship with it is a very healthy thing to do.
Thank you. Now, Kristen?
Just maybe to help a little bit, I would simply try to normalize that. It's not an unusual thing. At some points, pain is going to happen in the life of a meditator. So people have talked about Sangha, where you can share those things with others or with the teacher. So it's that's what happened to the human being. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a room for one question. Anybody? I guess everybody's in. Oh, there, Katie, of course.
I just wanted to add one more comment about the question of if somebody is not wanting to face pain. I think it's really important to just honor that there's something blocking, and to be really compassionate and curious about what that is. Because, you know, timing is everything in this inner world, and to be compassionate and kind to yourself or somebody who's saying that, like, and just to be available to when it is a moment that people are willing to look at stuff deeper, but to just honor where we're at in the moment.
Thank you. Just far away. Oh, Mary.
I'd like anybody in the panel, I'll use my teacher voice, Helen. I'd like anybody in the panel to comment on something that Bobby just brought up briefly, the whole idea of having a bad meditation session. Because as writers, you know, we're supposed to write badly every time we sit down and hope for the best. But if you could talk about bad meditation.
Well, it's really just subjective. In the study that I read about, the researchers divided the people up into two groups. They did all the brain imaging and everything before they meditated, and then they all meditated, and then they asked people, did you think you had a good meditation, or did you think you had a bad meditation? And the people who said they thought they had a bad meditation, they didn't tell us why they thought it was bad, but even though they thought they had a bad meditation, the brain scans showed that their brains benefited. So I don't know what they called a bad meditation. For me, I can speak personally for me, when I think I've had a bad meditation, it's usually because something in my body starts to ache. And I want to move. And I don't want to disturb the people around me, so I sit with the ache. And, you know, that disturbs my thought, makes me think about the ache, and so, yeah. So I'm always comforted by reminding myself, well, but my brain still benefited.
Yes,
Well, just in centering prayer, we don't say that you had a bad meditation. I mean, you can be sitting there and you can have 1,000 thoughts, and you're sitting there and you're letting them go, that sacred word, over and over again. But we don't judge that, because those 1,000 thoughts and those 1,000 returning to God's presence is saying, God, I love you. And so we're being healed in spite of our feelings. It isn't about that, or making a decision about how your meditation went. It isn't up to you to do. You just keep coming back.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. I wanted to ask the panelists if they have any question to ask a fellow panelist. So, would you have any question to ask?
What inspires you or keeps you going?
Oh, goodness. I think I have to say what inspires me is the opportunity for service. In fact, that's one of the things that my mentor kind of called me out on, because I have a tendency to always direct towards service to others and neglect a little bit my personal practice. And she noticed that and pointed it out to me. So I think my practice is a little more balanced now. But really, if I'm honest, I have to say what really inspires me and keeps me going is the opportunity for service to others.
Thank you.
I think it's my son, really. Because he's autistic, and he's also a meditation practitioner, and he's also starting to be a doctor, a neurosurgeon, I guess. That's what he's lined up to be. And so just watching him continue to develop, given what he came into the world with, sort of like, it's very inspiring, because it's like, well, you know, if he's doing what he's doing, you know, I better keep doing what I'm doing. So it's really that, I think, more than anything.
Well, I'm still relatively new at teaching mindfulness and meditation, and currently I teach in the county jail in a program for women only, and anybody would be inspired to see the response that you can get when you're able to bring people down, to calm, to bring some centering, and maybe because they are women, it's just sometimes astonishing to see how quickly they make relationship between what happened in the body, what happened in their life, emotional activity. There's just so much going on in a group setting, but there's just nothing else to do for me right now.
Thank you. Sandy, would you like to say something?
I think what inspires me is watching people grow and watching how they change. Or they'll come and they'll say, I really believe that God really loves me. They start to really believe in that unconditional love of God. Or they'll have made a big decision in their life, and if I hadn't centered, recently a woman came and said, I've made that decision after 35 years of marriage that I'm going to get a divorce. It's the best thing for me. And people keep coming back, and they keep centering, and they don't live in denial, most of the people in the groups. They're facing the concrete reality of everyday life, and many of them live extraordinary. They live their ordinary life with extraordinary love and compassion. We have a group of men that started working in the prisons, and Ed and I have gone out there with them a couple of times, and it's inspiring to sit there with lifers, they're lifers, and say, I have 20 minutes a day of silence. And I'm able to say that, I'm here because I need to be here, but it's the place that I know that God's present here.
Thank you. Leanne, you want to answer your own question? Thank you. At this stage, they say, ask not what your country can do for you, or you can for your country. So my own version for that would be, ask not what I can do for the audience, but what the audience can do for me. So I would like to ask for maybe one or two volunteers to just summarize what transpired here this afternoon, probably in 2 to 3 minutes. Any takers? Oh, okay. Joe, thank you.
Well, thank you all, 5 of you, for beautiful openness and presentation of your own hearts and souls to us. You reached really deep into your own lives and shared some really beautiful things. I was very moved and impressed by how each of you kind of got into the same place from a different beginning. 3 of you came into your practice because of your respect and love and being touched by a teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, a Zen Center, a Tibetan teacher that you met, God, and science. And it shows that there is a path here for everyone. You just can start anywhere. And with a good practice, you can come out with an open heart and love for yourself and for the world. And the 5 of you have all shown that beautifully, that there's so many choices. And I think it just shows that throughout the whole world, there can be many, many, many more choices of ways that people can find a practice that will bring us here, whether it's through Catholicism or through Islam or through atheism or whatever. There's a path. There's a path that will get us all here. So deep gratitude to all of you for showing that to us. Thank you.
Lovely.
I'd like to thank, of course, each and every one of you for coming to this gathering today. Thank you so much. The last time we had a symposium or a panel discussion like this was actually 20 years ago. And the title of the discussion was Women in Buddhism. And I have the women here who actually joined us at that time. And at that time, we had probably like 90 women and 10 men. So it's so inspiring to see more men at this time. And unfortunately, we don't have a male panelist, but I realized that most of the people who questioned were men anyway. So, in closing, I'd like to hand over the mic to Ruben.
Again, my heart is filled with gratitude to everyone for being here, and especially to the panelists who shared out of their lives and out of their practice. And before this event, there were groups who were already planning this event for months and months, and so among them, there are those who are here, and as Helen said, if I name them all, I'll point to them all. We would not have been able to accomplish this, so I really am grateful. Now, those of you who have heard something that you might want to follow up on, each of the panel members have a community out of which they find their support in their own practice. So if you would like to learn about how they practice and where they can, where you might be able to learn from them, we will still have another hour or so where you can stay and have some refreshments. We have some cookies and some water. Sorry, we don't have too much of a lavish feast here, but at least some of the basics. So please remain to continue the conversations on where you might want to connect with any of the panelists or the Maria Kannon Zen Center, which also offers regular meditation periods here in Dallas, as well as the Dallas Meditation Center, Sandy Guanxiao's Centering Prayer, being offered in so many churches throughout the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And again, I am also inspired by the fact that Christian Bod is beginning to teach meditation in the prison system. So if any one of you feels inspired, you don't have to be a fully accredited teacher yet, but if you would like to learn, you might want to join Christian and join in her visits to the prison system, and you might be inspired to deepen your own practice and also continue learning how you may be able to impart it to others. There's also the Tibetan Buddhist Center that Kay Lish is a member of, and they are a thriving center out in Irving. So if you're interested in checking out some of the practices of the Tibetans, please go and approach Kay. The sponsor here for this event, or one of the co-sponsors, is the Office of Spiritual Formation and also the Office of External Programs, which has a program in certification in spiritual direction. This is a program that helps people who would like to be able to walk with others in their spiritual journey to receive training and learn how to listen, how to point out issues that will differentiate psychological and spiritual issues and so forth. So it's a 3-year program wherein those who are interested can come for a weekend 3 times a year for 3 years, and at the end of those sessions then you are given a certificate that says you are now given in a training that we feel will enable you to walk with others on the spiritual path. So if you're interested in that, anyone, I can give you the details. You may approach me after this. And if there's anything else that you would like to ask about spiritual practice, we have our panelists. Again, so Helen has a word.
Yes, some of the panelists brought their books from the organization, so if you would like to buy a book or several books, they're available here on the right side of the room. And I guess that's it for today. Again, thank you.